Becca, and this is Deadly Truths, where history, horror, and humanity collide. Every episode, we go beyond the headlines and into the hidden corners of American violence, the soldiers, the murderers, the martyrs, and the ghosts that history tried to forget. Some of these stories are old, some are still unfolding, but they all ask the same question: what drives ordinary people to cross the line between duty and destruction? This is Deadly Truths. On the morning of June 17, 1933, Kansas City woke up to gunfire so brutal that newspapers didn't know what to call it. Bodies scattered across the Union Station parking lot like a war zone. Within seconds, a routine prisoner transfer turned into the bloodiest law enforcement ambush in American history. A slaughter so shocking it forced the government to rebuild the entire FBI from the ground up. But here's the truth Kansas City never shook. The massacre did not come out of nowhere. It was the final pressure point in a city run by mob bosses, corrupt cops, political machines, outlawed bootleggers, and a federal system that was completely outmatched. Before the bullets flew, the city was already a loaded gun. And today we're pulling the trigger back to see exactly who set off the Kansas City Massacre. Kansas City in the early 1930s wasn't just corrupt, it was engineered for violence. The city was controlled by Tom Pendergast, a political boss who turned the entire metro into a machine. Judges, police chiefs, detectives, city contracts, all of it flowed through him. If you crossed his organization, you didn't just lose your job, you vanished. Under Pendergast's umbrella, Kansas City became a sanctuary for criminals who were too hot to hide anywhere else. Outlaws like Pretty Boy Floyd, Adam Ricchetti, and remnants of the old Southwest bandit crews drifted in and out, protected by money, bribes, and police officers who did favors for the right price. This was not a city with a crime problem, it was a crime factory, mass-producing violence. At the center of this world sat one man whose name triggered fear in every federal office across the Midwest: Frank Jelly Nash. Nash was no small-time hood. He was a career criminal with a resume built on multiple prison escapes, armed robbery, safe cracking, a killing inside a post office robbery, and connections to half the major crime rings in the Midwest. He had a talent for survival, working smart, paying the right people, running quiet. Some agents called him the most successful bank robber in U.S. history because he rarely got caught and never talked. But in 1933, for the first time in 9 years, Nash slipped. He was arrested in Hot Springs after the feds finally traced him through a sloppy phone call. Hot Springs, another corrupt haven, had sheltered him for years, but when federal agents grabbed him, they knew exactly what they had: a high-value outlaw with enough enemies to fill a small-town cemetery. They moved fast to get him out of Arkansas before his friends or the police or the mob bosses realized it. That decision set off the chain reaction. Nash was loaded onto a train under federal guard. The transfer orders were clear: move him, keep him alive, no stops, no delays. But this was Kansas City in 1933. Nothing was ever clean. Word leaked. It always leaked. Somebody tipped off the wrong men that Frank Nash was coming through Union Station. Maybe it was a guard, maybe a gangster, maybe a police officer who decided Nash was worth more dead than he was alive. History still cannot agree on this. All we know for certain is it was a rescue plan. and started forming fast. Gunmen began converging on Union Station from different directions. They weren't amateurs. They had automatic weapons, timing, and a clear target. The feds thought they were doing a simple prisoner pickup. But Kansas City was already wired for blood, and Frank Nash was the spark. On June 17th of 1933, just after 7 a.m. in the morning, the heat was already rising off the Union Station pavement. The federal convoy pulled in fast. 2 cars, armed agents, and Frank Nash handcuffed in the back seat. They thought they were early enough to avoid attention. Inside the station, several witnesses later said they saw nervous men watching the platforms. Outside, an unmarked Chevrolet sedan was idling too long. Nobody connected the dots, not yet. The feds pulled up directly in front of the station's east entrance. The plan was simple. Move Nash from their car to an awaiting bureau vehicle and drive him to Leavenworth. 2 minutes of exposure. Tops. The transfer never got that far. As the agents opened the car door and pulled Nash out, a voice cut across the parking lot. Up, your hands. Hard, commanding, a trained voice. Not panicked, not a panicked outlaw. Before anyone could react, the first burst of gunfire exploded. This was not pistols. This was automatic. .45 caliber Thompson submachine guns, multiple shooters, high-capacity magazines. A coordinated barrage meant to overwhelm federal officers instantly. The first wave shredded the cars, blowing out windows, puncturing doors, ripping through metal like paper. Agents dove, grabbed for pistols, tried to use the vehicles as cover. It did not matter. The shooters were positioned to create a perfect crossfire. Agent Reed Vetterli was hit almost immediately. Detective Hermanson went down seconds later. Chief of Detectives Otto Reed tried to return fire but took a burst to the chest. Frank Nash, the man everyone was trying to rescue, never made it 6 feet from the car before he was torn apart by gunfire. Inside the station, people screamed and threw themselves to the floor. Outside, it was not a gunfight. It was an execution. Witnesses insisted they saw 3 gunmen. One was tall and athletic, one was shorter and stockier, one who moved like he knew exactly what he was doing. Some swore they recognized Pretty Boy Floyd and Adam Ricchetti. Both I discussed in detail in Season 3. I explain why this was not fact, but the evidence that the FBI presented at the time pointed the finger at Pretty Boy Floyd. Others argued it had to be local shooters working under Pendergast's umbrella, men who vanished as fast as they appeared. What's undeniable is how long the shooting lasted. 30 seconds. That's it. 30 seconds of non-stop automatic fire turned Union Station into a battlefield. When the shooters finally stopped, they walked, did not run, back to their car, climbed in, and sped away clean. When the smoke settled, 4 officers were dead. Nash was dead. 2 agents and a policeman were critically wounded. Over 50 rounds had blasted through the parking lot. The Bureau's credibility was in pieces. The federal government had been humiliated in broad daylight. The Midwest criminal underworld had just sent a message: we can outgun you anytime we want. The Kansas City Massacre was not just violence, it was a declaration of war. The evidence points overwhelmingly to the fact that they did want Frank Nash alive. And here's why. Frank Nash was a valuable asset. He was connected to major Midwest crime syndicates, bank crews, corrupt cops in Hot Springs, and possibly Pendergast-aligned officers. He knew names, he knew payoffs, he knew escape routes. He was worth far more as a living asset than a corpse. Every credible account says the gunmen were there to free Frank Nash, not to kill him. They called out a command first, which was up, your hands, before firing. That's consistent with an attempted breakout gone sideways. The feds were using him as cover, meaning Frank Nash, and the shooters were trying to eliminate the agents. Nash took bullets from both directions. Ballistics showed Nash was hit by federal ammunition as well as the attackers. What a way to go. That is not how you intentionally execute a target. In the criminal world of the 1930s, bragging rights mattered, but no shooter ever claimed responsibility for Nash's death, and the silence is telling. So again, this points to the fact that they were trying to break him out, so to speak, rather than execute him. The massacre was a rescue attempt gone catastrophically wrong. There's a lot of questions about, well, who were the shooters? And here's the factual, evidence-based breakdown, stripped of all the folklore. As I had mentioned, the FBI did pin the massacre at that time on 3 men. They said it was Charles Pretty Boy Floyd, who it was not, and they said it was Adam Ricchetti, which was the partner of Pretty Boy at the time. Again, it was not him. But they also mentioned Vern Miller. This became bureau gospel, especially after Floyd was killed and Ricchetti was hanged. But the evidence was paper thin on them, and as I discussed in the Pretty Boy Floyd episode, it definitely was not them. Who is for certain is Vern Miller. This shooter is 100%. Miller was a known killer. He was a former cop and professional fixer for organized crime. He had motive. He was friends with Nash, and he had means. He was heavily armed, ruthless, and mobile. He had opportunity. He was seen in Kansas City during the planning window. So we're certain that Vern Miller was there. He was a professional gunman with ties to Nash. His fingerprints are all over every step of that plot. The question remains, who were the others? This is the darkest and most suppressed angle. Evidence suggests local law enforcement helped plan the rescue and may have pulled the trigger. So, 2 Kansas City police officers working under Pendergast. And you might wonder why. Well, Nash had deep ties to Kansas City police corruption. His arrest threatened to expose them. There is also talk of a 4th unidentified gunman. Witnesses insisted on 3 shooters, but some heard and saw a 4th man coordinating. What's our bottom line? The Kansas City Massacre was likely carried out by Vern Miller, plus corrupt Kansas City cops. And most definitely not Pretty Boy Floyd. Was the massacre a rescue or a cleanup operation to silence Nash? And the record supports strongly that it was a rescue attempt. There's no credible evidence that it was a targeted execution, and if it was definitely sloppy. So let's take a deep dive into the act itself, the real raw details. When the federal convoy arrived, Frank Nash was handcuffed, seated between 2 officers, which was FBI agent J. Raymond Caffrey, Frank Hermanson, that was Kansas City PD, and then there was Chief Otto Reed, McAllister PD. That was the Nash car. The second federal car, which was behind the first, had agents Lackey and Vetterly. Police officer W.J. Grooms. They were backup, supposed to exit and flank the first car. They barely made it out before the shooting started. Based on ballistic angles, witnesses' testimony, and body placement, gunman 1 was behind a green 1931 Chevrolet sedan parked facing the station. His weapon was a Thompson machine gun. The role that he was playing was main suppressive fire. Gunman 2, that position was to the right of the federal cars near the station steps. Also, this gunman had a Thompson machine gun, and they were angling the crossfire that made cover useless. Gunman 3, that position was closer to the passenger side of the federal cars, and that weapon was a high-powered rifle and possibly a second Thompson gun. The role of the third gunman was finishing shots and targeting movement. This is why the agents did not stand a chance. They were hit from 3 overlapping attack vectors and no real cover. Multiple witnesses and surviving agents remembered the first words were up your hands, which I had discussed. One survivor said the voice was deep, trained, authoritative, not the panicked shouts of a thief. This is strong evidence supporting that this is a rescue. You shout the command before you fire if you want the feds to surrender that prisoner. The command lasted about 2 seconds. Then the gunfire started mid-command. That timing does matter. It suggests that one gunman intended a standoff, another opened fire early, or someone panicked when an agent moved. And this is how the rescue attempt turns into a bloodbath. The first burst of gunfire, it was about 6 to 10 rounds, and the initial Thompson spray hit the driver's side window, the rear half of the car, the passenger side door. Frank Nash instantly wounded. Agent Caffrey, fatal chest shot. Officer Hermison, multiple hits. The first burst alone incapacitated half of the federal team. The second wave was full automatic. Within 3 to 5 seconds, both Thompsons were firing full auto. Cars were shredded so severely that door handles were pulverized, glass and metal fragments embedded in the concrete, windows imploded inward, showering agents with shrapnel, and Nash's handcuffs were found bent and bullets scored. A forensic exam later showed over 50 bullet strikes on the primary vehicle. Agents crawling out of the second car were immediately pinned down by the crossfire. The feds did try to return fire. Agent Lackey managed to draw his .38. He fired at least 3 shots. He did not hit anything. The gunmen were concealed and armored by the car. Agent Vetterly, he did try to exit the vehicle. He was hit in the spine and he was dropped instantly. Officer Grooms, he attempted to flank right and he caught 3 rounds to the abdomen. The feds were outgunned, outpositioned, and ambushed by superior weapons. Handguns versus there was no contest. Autopsies later confirmed most fatal shots were head and upper torso. The majority came from the front and right angles. Nash himself died from multiple rounds from both sides, including the federal bullets, as I had mentioned. The shooters didn't walk up and execute the wounded. There was no coup de grace shots, no close range finishing. They fired, controlled the kill zone, then retreated fast. The shooters then stopped firing abruptly. Witnesses saw 3 men jogging, not running, with weapons low, merging into the Chevrolet, which peeled out northbound at high speed. The precision of the exit strongly implies that this was a planned rescue team with a getaway pattern in place. Professionals, not thrill killers. 22 seconds of continuous gunfire. 8 seconds of movement and get away. That's why the federal agents never had a chance. That's why the crime scene was chaos. And that's why identifying the shooters was almost impossible. When you look at the physical evidence, it tells us the shooters were highly trained. Their fields of fire were perfectly overlapped. They expected the feds to surrender. The warning shout proves intention to capture. Someone panicked or misfired, and the premature burst destroyed the rescue attempt. Nash died in that crossfire not on purpose. He was literally caught between two Thompson angles. The attack team was more professional than the FBI assumed. Everything about it, timing, weapons, angles, retreat, screams, organized, disciplined, practiced. When the smoke cleared at Union Station, the federal government wasn't just embarrassed, it was exposed. 4 lawmen slaughtered in public, a prisoner dead before he reached the courthouse, witnesses diving behind columns to avoid machine gun bursts. This was not just a failure, it was a national humiliation. And J. Edgar Hoover, still fighting to keep control of a young, fragile bureau, realized instantly this massacre could destroy him. He moved before the bodies were cold. The Kansas City Star printed the phrase, organized execution within hours. The public response was instant outrage. Congress demanded answers. The Bureau had none. Hoover convened emergency meetings in Washington. The message was simple: fix the Bureau or lose it. The massacre lit a fire under lawmakers, and they acted fast. The ambush changed everything. Within months, Congress passed laws that gave the Bureau the power to carry firearms nationwide, no more asking for permission. Power to make arrests without local approval. Agents no longer had to wait for sheriffs who were drunk, corrupt, or both. Power to pursue fugitives across state lines. Criminals could no longer escape by crossing a bridge. A national fingerprint file and identification system. The modern crime database was born out of this massacre. Federal jurisdiction over kidnapping, bank robbery, and interstate crime. This turned the FBI from a detective agency into a true federal law enforcement power. The Kansas City Massacre built the modern FBI. Vern Miller, well, the one guy that we do know that most likely did participate in the Kansas City Massacre, he was killed violently in Detroit. His body was dumped in a snowbank, beaten beyond recognition. There was no trial, there was no confession, just elimination. Pretty Boy Floyd, as I had discussed in his episode in season 3, he was shot in Ohio by the FBI. Hoover turned Floyd into the poster boy of the massacre. It didn't matter that the evidence was not there. It did not matter that Floyd denied being at Union Station as he bled out. The Bureau needed a win. Floyd became that trophy. And Adam Ricchetti, his partner, he was captured, convicted, and he was hung. It was a rushed trial, shaky witnesses, and predetermined narrative. Ricchetti did not stand a chance. The truth hides in all the details. After the dust settled, researchers started noticing patterns. Ballistics did not match the Bureau's story. Witnesses contradicted each other. The timeline was inconsistent. Kansas City police corruption was deeper than anyone wanted to admit. More and more historians began to conclude the FBI solved the massacre politically, not factually. Vern Miller? Yes. Ricchetti? Floyd? Almost certainly not. There's a darker possibility, one that Kansas City insiders whispered for decades. Corrupt Kansas City cops involved in this shooting. Men with badges, men with motives, men who would have been untouchable in Pendergast's Kansas City. Hoover never pursued that angle. He could not. He would have destroyed the Bureau's biggest victory. Union Station cleaned the blood off the pavement, but the city never came clean of that massacre. It exposed the depth of Pendergast's corruption, the reach of organized crime in the Midwest, the fragility of federal power, and how quickly the truth can vanish when the government needs a story more than it needs accuracy. The Kansas City Massacre didn't just reshape the FBI, it reshaped the American myth of law and order. And in Kansas City, where the bullets hit the pavement, the real truth still sets under decades of politics, silence, and fear. I think this is a really good time to do a deep dive on Vern Miller because honestly, he was one of the most dangerous men from that time frame and nobody remembers him. Vern Miller was not folklore. He was not a dime novel outlaw. He was a stone cold professional killer, ex-law enforcement, military trained, disciplined, and absolutely merciless when he needed to be. And unlike most gangsters from the 1930s, Miller could do something rare. He could plan, execute, and disappear. So let's go straight into the facts. Before he became a criminal, he served as a sheriff for South Dakota. He was a decorated World War I veteran, and he was a respected lawman with political ties. This matters because he knew police procedure. He knew how lawmen moved during prisoner transfers. He had tactical training. He could anticipate and exploit law enforcement gaps. The massacre was not an amateur hour. It was someone with law enforcement intelligence weaponizing it. It's Miller. Miller and Frank Nash were longtime associates and friends. They weren't casual acquaintances. The relationship went back years. Both ran in the same bank robbery and prison escape networks. Both trusted the same middlemen. And most importantly, Miller owned Nash. What was the debt? Well, Frank Nash was known in criminal circles for doing favors, quietly removing problems, bribing guards, and arranging lawyers, providing safe houses too. Miller was one of the men Nash had helped in the past. And in the underworld of the 1920s and the 1930s, that created a bond more powerful than money. If your friends were captured, you got them back. No questions, no hesitation. That's why Miller mobilized so fast when Nash was arrested. Multiple independent witnesses also placed him in Kansas City. He was staying at the Hotel Congress only days before the massacre. He was also seen at 2 Kansas speakeasies, again, right before the massacre. And then he was seen meeting with known corrupt officers connected to Pendergast, again, just a couple of days before the massacre. And to top it off, it's the cherry on top, he was driving a green Chevrolet similar to the gunman's car. The Bureau did try to bury some of these accounts because they didn't fit their pretty boy Floyd narrative. But historians pieced it all together later, just like they always do. Miller was in town. Miller was the right skill set. Miller had a motive. He's the common denominator in every credible version of this story. The rescue plan was pure Miller. The layout of the ambush reflects Miller's tactical background. 3 firing angles positioned for maximum crossfire. Lawmen don't think like that unless they've done it before. And then the initial verbal command to surrender, common in law enforcement operations, almost unheard of in outlaw ambushes. The clean withdrawal with coordinated retreat. That is military precision, not moonshine bandit chaos. No attempt to loot weapons or rob the dead. This was not a criminal free-for-all. This was a task-specific hit. Get Nash out. The moment Nash was killed by crossfire, the entire mission collapsed. Everything after that was escape and damage control. And the last hard fact, Miller did not survive long after that massacre because he was not supposed to. 5 months later, Miller's mutilated body was found in a Detroit suburb. His skull was smashed, his ribs were broken, he was dumped in the snow, his hands were crushed, body staged like a gangland warning. That is not random. That is an execution. Why? Because he failed to rescue Nash. A failed operation could get you killed in a syndicate. He knew too much about corrupt Kansas City police, and they needed him silent. The FBI also needed a scapegoat. Miller being dead, well, that solved a problem and closed the narrative. Someone in the underworld did not want Miller to talk. He was a liability alive. And without Vern Miller, the Kansas City Massacre simply would not have happened. No one was ever officially charged with Vern Miller's murder, but there is hard, high confidence facts, including crime scene details, witness accounts, and underworld intelligence that point to who killed him and why. Miller's body was found on November 29th, 1933 in East Detroit. And the details that I had mentioned earlier about how he was found speak volumes. Crushed skull, several ribs broken, his hands had been shattered. This is a classic mob warning. His pockets were empty. He was identified by fingerprints. This was not a robbery. This was not a scuffle. This was an intentional, prolonged beating by multiple men. The autopsy confirmed several head wounds, broken jaw, crushed ribs and sternum, multiple lacerations and fractures, defensive wounds on his arms. This was an interrogation beating that turned into an execution. They didn't shoot him because they didn't want a noisy scene. They beat him to death because they wanted to send a message. Miller was last seen alive in Detroit with known mob associates. This is not a rumor. This is documented through hotel registrations, bartender statements, eyewitness reports, and later grand jury notes. The men he was with belonged to the Purple Gang, and I had discussed them when I was doing my first season on Reno in Nevada. The Purple Gang, Detroit's feared Jewish mob syndicate, and he was also seen with Kansas City connected gunmen. The names that were tied to his last movements before his death were Abe Axler from the Purple Gang, Eddie Fletcher, again, the Purple Gang, Benny Bernie Levine. He is a Kansas City linked enforcer. And then there was John Lazia, the remaining Kansas City hitter. Purple Gang ran Detroit's bootlegging networks and had heavy business ties with the Kansas City machine. Miller was considered too hot after that massacre. The FBI was openly hunting him. He knew names, he knew money trails, he knew corrupt cops in Kansas City, he knew who tipped off the Union Station ambush, and he was talking too much while trying to secure help. A man with that much knowledge was a liability. Underworld intelligence says Miller was killed by the Kansas City mob enforcers with the Purple Gang's blessing. Multiple independent sources, including FBI informants, Underworld memoirs, and later declassified notes from the FBI, all point to the same conclusion. Vern Miller was killed by a joint team of Kansas City mobsters and Purple Gang hitmen because he was about to expose corrupt officers tied to the Kansas City Massacre. This is not legend. These are overlapping accounts from former Kansas City political machine insiders, Detroit organized crime witnesses, later mob historians, and FBI files. The Kansas City connection matters because Miller was tied to police officers in Pendergast's orbit, and those men could not be implicated. Killing Miller shut down the door on the angle permanently. Hoover's and Turner memos, laterly partially released, did include cryptic lines suggesting Miller was talking. Kansas City police corruption was deeper than politically known. The Bureau learned the wrong people might have been at Union Station, and Hoover ordered agents to let the Detroit police handle it. Hoover wanted Miller dead because if Miller talked, the official FBI story about the massacre would collapse. And then there's this. The method of death matches Kansas City mob enforcement style. It was not Chicago style. It was not the traditional Purple Gang method. This is key. The Purple Gang usually shot their victims. Kansas City enforcers beat their targets to death when secrecy was required. Miller's Killing matches the Kansas City technique exactly. Hand smashed, skull fractured, body dumped as a warning. No weapons used, no shots fired. This was a Kansas City hit carried out with Detroit's cooperation so it wouldn't tie back home. So that is the hard, sharp verdict. It was a joint hit squad involving Kansas City mob enforcers still loyal to Pendergast Machine and the Purple Gang associates in Detroit. And why the City Massacre was the borough's worst failure, and within months, Hoover flipped it into its greatest victory. For Miller dying without a trial sealed that win. No cross-examination, no testimony, no names spilled, no embarrassing revelations about corrupt Kansas City cops or FBI mistakes. Hoover's FBI walked out of this with more power than it had ever dreamed of. But if you want to ask, well, maybe that was good for the FBI. It isn't automatically good for justice. Here's the darker truth. The wrong men were blamed. Pretty Boy Floyd almost certainly was not there. Ricchetti's trial was shaky at best, and he was hung. Local corrupt officials who may have helped plan the ambush were never touched and got away scot-free. The real motives were buried, and Nash was more valuable alive. The attack wasn't a slaughter by design, it was a rescue mission gone wrong, and Hoover didn't want a scandal, he wanted a mandate, and he got one. Yes, it was good for the FBI's survival, their power, and their authority, and no, it was not good for accuracy, honesty, or the historical record. The FBI got bigger, stronger, and more feared because of this massacre. But the truth got buried with Vern Miller. That tension, justice versus power, narrative versus facts, it's exactly what makes the Kansas City Massacre one of the most important cases in American criminal history. It is one of those moments where American history bends, not because justice was served, but because the right people seized the moment. The FBI walked out of the Union Station stronger than it had walked in. Congress handed them guns, the jurisdiction, and the authority they had been begging for. Hoover got the narrative he needed, a federal agency outgunned by ruthless criminals fighting to protect the nation. And maybe that was good for the country. Maybe it was necessary, but it came at a cost. Frank Nash, the man at the center of this storm, never fired a shot. He was chained, unarmed, and caught between two groups of men who both wanted him alive for different reasons. He died in the crossfire, not as a mastermind and not as a martyr, but as a hinge in a power struggle bigger than he ever imagined. Vern Miller, the man who tried to pull Nash out of federal custody, paid the ultimate price too. Not in a courtroom, not in front of a jury, but in a ditch in Detroit with his skull crushed in and his hands broken. A message to everyone who knew too much about what really happened in Kansas City. Truth died alongside him. But the people we cannot lose in the politics and the myth-making are the ones who had no say in any of this. The officers who stepped into the parking lot expecting a routine prisoner transfer and ended up ambushed by automatic gunfire. They didn't ask for politics. They didn't ask for the corruption. They didn't ask to become symbols in a federal power shift. They were lawmen doing their jobs. So tonight, we say their names clearly, without decoration, without spin, because they deserve more than the footnotes history left them. Special Agent J. Raymond Caffrey, Detective Frank Hermanson, Chief Otto Reed, Officer W.J. Grooms. 4 men who walked into the unknown and never walked back out. They weren't part of a machine. They weren't part of an underworld. They weren't part of the narrative that Hoover needed to build his empire. They were victims of a system that failed them, a system where criminals were protected, police were compromised, and the truth wasn't powerful enough to save anyone. The Kansas City Massacre built the FBI we know today, but for men who died, the story isn't about federal authority or gangster mythology. It's about a morning in June when duty collided with corruption and innocent lawmen paid for everyone else's sins. And that's the deadly truth behind the Kansas City Massacre. You've been listening to Deadly Truths. I'm Becca. If this episode hit you hard, Hey, please follow, rate it, share it on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, wherever you're listening or watching. Every single rating pushes this series deeper into the algorithm and keeps these stories from getting buried again. Next time, we're going to discuss the two trunks murder for Kansas City. And if you have been listening to all the seasons, you're probably thinking, wait a second, you did a two trunks episode for Kentucky season 4, but here's the kicker. There's another case. It involves two trunks. Yes, a murder in Kansas City. Kentucky was not the only place shipping dead bodies. We're going to dig into a very chilling early case in Kansas City history. The Union Depot two trunks murder. One victim, two trunks, a killer traced through boarding houses and baggage rooms. A case so sensational that newspapers across the Midwest fought each other to cover it. This research and narration is always done by me. I'm sure you can tell. The sources for this episode did include period newspapers, court archives, regional homicide records, and historical criminology research. You can find all of the resources in the show notes as always. And remember, the past is not dead. It's just being forged inside Kansas City's murder factory.